Good evening. Thank you for joining us for our first Solutionaries live chat. I'm Robert Arnold, an investigative reporter at KPRC-2 News in Houston. We're part of the Solutionaries network focused on reporting the creative and impactful solutions people are coming up with for the issues that you care about most. And this week we're focused on the most important issue, keeping children safe in schools. Joining me tonight is Mike Matranga, a retired U.S. Secret Service agent who now runs M6 Global Defense Group. Mike works to build safety and security plans, particularly focused on K-12 schools. And I recently interviewed Mike for our latest Solutionaries episode. Now, that story that we had done looked at two different aspects. It looked at the physical security, the physical securing of campuses, but also that holistic approach, because you had said that we have to drill down and get to the problem, the root causes of violence that we see on campus. And that's where we talked about Communities in School, that program that brings an entire community's worth of support into a classroom. So that was what we had focused on, and I know you're here now to follow up to help us answer some more questions. And we've asked viewers across the country to send in their questions for Mike about school safety and security. And if you're watching live, you can text the word safety to 866-996-5772, and we'll try to get your question in during this stream. But let's go to our first question. It's from Andrea in the Houston area, and she asks about school drills. Schools have to be prepared, but what can you do as a parent to try to prepare your child at home? You had talked about how everybody needs to try to learn the signs of pre-attack behavior. And so Andrea is asking, what can we do at home? What's too young to broach this subject, and how do you breach this subject with a child?
Yeah, I think that, when we approach talking to a child, we've got to keep in context, the age appropriateness of the child. You talk to a kid in their teenage years, of course, you're going to be able to have more in-depth conversations about some of the seriousness of these things. But, with littler kids, I think that parents need to focus on that age appropriateness, tone down the rhetoric, don't focus on it being such a scary subject, but primarily focus on the things that they can change, not only at school, but in society in general. And that's just being situationally aware of their surroundings, right? So, what we see in Texas and throughout the United States is that school districts are demanding or requiring lockdown drills, which I personally feel like, yes, they are beneficial, but they can be traumatic. So we need to talk to them about those are not intended to be traumatic situations or traumatic drills. They're intended to create a higher or a heightened situational awareness for the staff, for the students, and it increases that situational awareness for them. So, like I said, the age appropriateness of it, it doesn't need to be scary. It should be just like we require our law enforcement officers to have soft skills when working with kids, our parents should keep that in mind as well. It's the soft skills are going to be what matters.
So what age should you start talking about this subject?
I think that, you start to see some of these events unfolding in elementary. I mean, look at Robb Elementary. It was very young kids. So I would say that first grade, second grade would be age appropriate. I think that, anything below that, their kids are just not going to grasp the concept or the importance of what they need to do.
And I've noticed some schools, like my son's school, when he was in kindergarten, it wasn't an active shooter drill. It was a dog was loose in the hallway. That's how they did. So things like that when you're trying to talk to the younger children about just paying attention to what's going on and things of that nature.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that we need to, though active shooters situations are, they grab all the headlines and they have a lot of focus in the conversations that we're having, keeping schools safe. People lose track that there are other things that could be hazardous to students on campus, such as, gang violence, bullying situations, drugs, alcohol consumption, a dog loose on the playground, a weather-related incident. So teaching the kids at a young age to be situationally aware of their surroundings at school and on campus is also going to transfer to their day-to-day life outside when they're on vacation or when they're, with their friends at the mall. So keeping your head up, keep being situationally aware, understanding what you need to do, teaching them the importance
What would you tell them? Like, what would be a good safety plan for, especially a younger child? Like, I know situational awareness is a big term, and you hear it all the time. But to a younger child, it's like, pay attention, right? So, what would you kind of say to a younger child about to try and warn them so they can stay safe, but like you said, not scare them?
I think that we need to start focusing on talking to kids about things such as, listen, there are drills, there are requirements in those drills. We have an outline of those drills of what you're supposed to do. For example, the standard response protocols, I Love You Guys Foundation put together, very nice, very well articulated, let's say, for example, lockdown, locks, lights, out of sight, get into a classroom, go into the hard corner. That's what we're teaching the kids. But what we're failing to teach them is also how to think on their own. One of the terminologies that I like to teach to staff and to students is an old military terminology of the OODA loop, and that's observe, orient, decide, and act. Listen, you may, like for example in Parkland, you may get hung out into a hallway with a locked door, and the instruction is not to open that door once it's locked. If you can't find an unopened door to seek refuge, and you've got a way to safely egress that building and run from the situation, run. I think we get locked into teaching these kids, this is the standard response protocol, this is the lockdown drill, this is exactly what's required or expected of you. Hey, listen, if I have the chance to seek refuge in a locked door inside of an active shooter situation, or I can just exit the door and run a block away to safety, that's what I'm going to do, and that's what I teach my kids, my own personal kids, to do. And so I think parents need to have these very open and honest dialogue, this conversation with them about what's reasonable, right? Yes, there's a rule for everything, but what makes sense, okay? And so I would encourage parents to, let's not get into a situation where we're scaring kids by giving them the worst possible scenario, but let's talk through different scenarios. Hey, a dog gets on campus, what are you gonna do? An active shooter is in there. I have the option to seek refuge in a classroom, or I have the option to run out of a door. The obvious answer would be run out of the door. And so it's really, really important for the parent to keep it light. The importance is that we want to teach the kids how to start utilizing their own, coping skills and mechanisms of how to, engage that OODA loop of observing the situation, orienting yourself to it, deciding what you're going to do, and then act on it. And
I like that.
Constantly going back into that loop. That's why they call it the OODA loop.
I like that. All right. Let's go to our next question. Our next question is from Conrad in the San Antonio area, and he asks, what about reserve officers with 20 plus years of experience who want to protect our children but are only allowed to work like so-called traffic jobs? How do we change that to where maybe you have these very seasoned officers working on these campuses?
Yeah, I think that the Texas legislature is actually working on that. Senator Campbell just had a roundtable meeting on August the 9th, and that was one of the topics that she had brought subject matter experts. I was invited, I could not make it, but that was one of the topics that she was working on was, how do we engage those law enforcement officers? How do we have them, maybe on a day that they're not working their full-time job, a reserve officer come in, or even former military. And so I like the program. I think it's, there are programs out there it's called Watchdogs.
For
yes,
dads, for the
right?
dads. They come in and spend a day.
Yeah, so if we've got a program like Watchdogs for fathers, we should have the same for active law enforcement, reservists, and military officers. Why can't we put together a very robust program as a force multiplier to the existing security that they have on those campuses? I'm all about that. Right.
Now, I know, let's talk about personalities, though, because one of the things when we had spoken earlier is I know that you are definitely a proponent of having an officer on campus.
I am.
But I pushed back a little bit on that and said, well, that there's a sentiment that there's too much law enforcement, that really law enforcement should not be there. And that's when you had explained to me about some of the personalities. So let's talk about the type of personalities that should be on a campus in a law enforcement setting.
Well, I think that the personality for a law enforcement officer on campus or whether they be on the street should be the same. It should be to protect and to serve and to offer assistance to whether it be citizens or whether it be students. In particular, officers on campuses have to have a certain set of soft skills. You know, they're there to enforce the law. And I think that what we see a lot of times is that administration oftentimes has them doing crossover work in kind of that administrative field of doing things that they're not intended to do or never
like
intended.
more for discipline rather
like
than
discipline,
yeah.
right? Enforcement of dress code. Those are negative interactions that those children are going to have with those officers, which is not helping, you know, the current sentiment throughout the nation of law enforcement being villainized. So, you know, I would say that what we need to do in the education space is to make sure that we're promoting healthy relationships between our students and our officers, and those officers have to understand that they're there to enforce the law. They're there to protect the staff, the students, and the community, and that they're there to build relationships. That's, you know, I tell people all the time, you know, when we had, you know, officers at Texas City ISD, where I was the former executive director, it's about building the relationship. You know, if you're building a relationship with a student in first grade, second grade, third grade, and, you know, through the elementary school years into middle school and into high school, when they become an adult, they know you've established that relationship. You may not have to fight them on the street, and it starts there. So, you know, having law enforcement in schools is not a terribly bad thing. It only becomes a terribly bad thing when it's mismanaged and when the intent and their purpose is misconstrued.
Well, you were after you retired from the Secret Service, I know one of the first things you did, you took over security for Texas City ISD, and you had officers on campus.
We did.
And you had said that there was a fine line there in the type of temperament that that the officers had that would work on campus, and those that maybe were good officers but weren't necessarily a good fit for being a school officer. Correct.
Yeah, you know, one of the first, well, actually the first decision, executive decision I had to make was reviewing an officer who we had, you know, had some incidents of excessive force. And listen, officers on the campuses are not supposed to be, you know, if need be, they need to apply force, but when you have a pattern and history of excessive force, maybe school resource officer is not for you, and it's not for everyone. And so I would caution school districts and advise them that they need to have a very robust vetting process when they do that, that not everybody's fit for that environment. And so it's got to be the right person, you know. If not, you're opening yourself up for civil liability, and nobody wants that. We need to be establishing trust with these students and with the staff, and primarily with the parents as well. Parents need to trust that when they send their kids to school, that their kids are going to be safe.
Okay.
You know.
Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about training programs. KSAT, our partner in San Antonio, reported on the alert training, and they talk about, you know, they go for everything from the active shooter training to bullying in schools and all. So help us understand what this training entails. So officers that are trained for active shooters and for other types of critical incidents in an educational setting, what is that training like?
Yeah, so alert training is a very well-established training that's based out of Texas State University. They've been in existence for a very long time. I believe, and my proposal to the Senate and to the governor's staff was that every officer graduating from a law enforcement college or with their law enforcement TCOL certification coming out of the state of Texas's certification process needs to have alert. Alert training needs to be part of the curriculum to become a law enforcement officer in the state of Texas. One of the things that we saw not only in Santa Fe but also in Robb, Sutherland Springs, and pretty much all of these things that have happened in Texas is that not every officer had the training or understanding of how to respond to that active shooter event. You know, Robb Elementary is probably one of the worst I've ever seen response, and not to call them out directly, but you know, you have to call a spade, and at the end of the day, in an active shooter event, especially when children are being harmed, you cannot hesitate. And that's what alert teaches, is that there's no hesitation. First officer on the scene is the incident commander until they're relieved of their duty. You get in there, you stop the killing, you stop the shooting, and you do it as violent as you need to protect and to preserve life. And so I'm a big fan of alert. I think that, like I said, it should be the standard throughout the state for every law enforcement officer.
Now,
how we get there, I don't know.
Right. Now, one of the things that came out of some of the hearings, it was a House committee, it was a joint hearing between Homeland Security and Youth Safety, and one of the things that really came out of that was it's one thing to get the alert training, but a lot of times people get rusty, and with a lot of this training, it's a muscle memory issue. And so the police chiefs that testified there were advocating for regular, more mandatory training. What are your thoughts on that? Because if somebody goes through the alert course, but then they don't go through it again and have no need of it for 5 years, I would think you could lose those skills.
Correct, 100%. Yeah, so I'm a former counter-assault team, presidential counter-assault team operator. And our instructors used to tell us, hey, it takes 10,000 repetitions to become proficient. And I will tell you that I think that law enforcement in general throughout the United States is very well behind on training. Some of these agencies that are in these schools, or even not even in the schools, but municipalities, local, Houston, they don't qualify enough, even with their handguns. And so, it's like me picking up an AR-15 rifle, shooting it one time, qualifying, and then not qualifying again for another year or 2 years or maybe never, because some of these people may have the alert training and then they haven't gone back through a refresher in 2, 3, 4, 5 years, or maybe never. You're going to lose some of those skills. It is right. You're right. There is muscle memory that is involved here. So, I think that needs to be reviewed. The problem is funding. Funding and manpower. It takes time to train these individuals to a certain standard. For example, one of the things, and this is kind of getting not off topic, but somewhat relevant based upon the training conversation that we're having, is talk about Marshall's program. Most of the Marshals, the 80-hour course, 16 hours every year, that's just not enough to me. If I were designing the Marshals course, I would make it mandatory that these individuals qualified every quarter.
And so for those not familiar, that's the school marshal program. That's where certain staff members are allowed to be armed.
Well, but it goes beyond that, though. I mean, it's even if we're not talking about school marshals, let's talk about just police officers in general. They need to be shooting more than once a year. There's a lot of agencies that require their officers to shoot once a year. They have to be proficient. The accuracy rate for law enforcement involved shootings is below 50%. It's probably because, and it's primarily because, they don't shoot enough. They don't train enough. Just like shooting your weapon, you also need to learn de-escalation tactics and learn how to use your mouth so that you don't have to use your gun. Those are the type of soft skills that we need in our schools. The first weapon that we use in schools, or really on the street at all in law enforcement, shouldn't be our weapon. It should be our mouth. And so that's what we need more of.
All right, thank you. All right, so we did just get a text question in, and this is from Eric, who's in the Houston area. Eric's first question: what can we do on college campuses to increase security in the classroom? That's a different animal than a K-12.
That is a completely different animal. Yes, it is a completely different animal. Good question, Eric. It depends upon on the college and what their policy is, but Texas is a license to carry state. I am certain that there are individuals that are on college campuses that are armed. Listen,
some other police department, like University of Houston, has its own police department, but not everybody does.
Yeah, not everyone does. It depends on the size of the school. I believe that most college campuses, if they don't have their own police department, just like in a school district, they need to have a very robust and holistic plan for response. And that starts with conversations with the responding agencies. And these conversations have to be realistic conversations. Just because you have a gun and a badge doesn't mean you get to play on game day. What we're seeing as a common trend throughout the United States is that everybody with a badge and a gun during an active shooter event shows up to a scene and creates chaos. And it tells me that, one, whoever planned their emergency operations plan or tactical response plan was just checking boxes. And then again, there was not enough training and repetition to identify or make the individual who, like in Robb Elementary, Chief Arredondo, now former Chief Arredondo, make him realize that maybe he wasn't in charge when he knew he was, right? So to get back to Eric's question, it has to start with very honest and open conversations, and people's feelings have to be left at the door. You know, you have to assess the ability of those people that are responding, and then you have to build that plan based upon the ability of those people that are responding. Listen, sometimes the biggest, sometimes the brightest may not be the ones that are taking command because they can't get there fast enough. And it has to do with your response times. So,
and I think you touched on it. Eric had a second question. I think you started to touch on this, and that's, well, what can we do for security when police are understaffed?
That's when we have those conversations with other departments, and we bring in other resources, and we combine those resources, and we do that based upon, like I said, skill, ability, response time. And you know, one of the things, like I said, open and honest conversations, feelings being left at the door. You bring everyone in who wants to participate in the event that there is an issue. You ask everyone certain questions like, what's your response time? Can you get here within a certain time period? And then you, whoever's in charge, has to say and has to delegate who's a primary responder, who's a secondary responder. And if you're a secondary responder, someone that is in charge has to say, thank you for volunteering your time and your resources. We'd prefer that you go to the staging area, wait on the primary responders who are going to be able to get there in an expeditious amount of time to call you in. Because if we have...
In other words, not a free-for-all where just everybody shows up.
Listen, look at Santa Fe, look at Uvalde. It's a free-for-all. You know, when you have an incident commander now not saying that he didn't know he was in charge when he wrote the policy, that's nonsense, and it's unacceptable.
So as a parent, how do you push on that? And we have one more question from Eric, and I'll get to that in a second, but I want to keep in that vein because I want to ask, as a parent now, how much can you put, because a lot of these plans are not public, and for good reason.
Correct.
I mean, I understand that.
Right.
But as a parent, how much can you push? What questions should parents be asking of school districts about what they have done to ensure something like a Uvalde doesn't happen? And I don't mean just the 77 minutes. I mean the fact that you had a massive agency show up that had never trained together. And so they didn't really know how to fold themselves into one operation, so to speak.
Yeah, I think, you know, really the solution to this is going to be the parents. You know, I'm a school board member at Texas City ISD. I was the executive director. I'm now a school board member. I will tell you, the one thing that gets school boards and superintendents to moving is parents. You know, parents and lawyers. And I'm not encouraging, you know, people to go out and hire attorneys, but what I am encouraging is parents to get involved. Show up to your school board meetings. Ask the hard questions. Don't just take people for their word. Make sure that you know that your kids are safe when you drop them off at school. Make sure that that your school district is in compliance with the state laws and mandates. I'm certain that the majority of the people in the state of Texas who have kids in the state were not aware that just this past year, only 67 of the 1,022 campuses or school districts were compliant with the Texas School Safety Center's regulations and mandates that were passed in 2019, which was Senate Bill 11.
Following Santa Fe, which came about because of Santa Fe.
There was over a dozen mandates after Santa Fe. None of them worked in Uvalde. You know why? Because no one can sit down and have reasonable, hard conversations and delegate authority based upon skill, based upon ability. And that's what we have to do. Listen, our kids, the future of America is at stake. We have to get serious. And parents, I encourage you, get out there and ask questions to your school board members.
All right, so now for the old one, go back because Eric did have a third question. He asked, you know, how can students in college keep themselves safe when officers can't be there 24/7 or maybe can't get there, you know, quickly? And I know that there's, you know, one of the answers will be, you know, to maybe possibly look into carrying yourself on that, but that can't be the only answer because there's a lot of people who are not comfortable doing that. So what can a college student do to keep themselves safe?
Well, I will tell you, even college campuses, college students range from the age of 18 to 24, depending on how much partying they do, I guess. But, kids or young adults, I don't want to say kids, I don't want to insult anyone, but young adults at 18 can't carry a pistol, and so they are, I would say they're just as vulnerable as students that are in high school because they don't have that means to protect themselves. And so it goes back to what I talked about earlier: observe, orient, decide, act. I'm not encouraging that anyone lives in a state of panic or fear, right? But what you should do every day, when it pertains to you and your loved ones, these people are going to eventually have children, they're going to have families of their own. When you're walking through society on a day-to-day basis, you're driving your car, you're walking in the mall, you're at a Sam Houston State football game, my alumni. My school, my college, pay attention to your surroundings. Watch what's going on. Know the difference between cover and concealment. That, if something were to happen, have a plan. And it doesn't have to be anything that's going to
just kind of know where the exits are, maybe a call box. Like
know where the exits
call
are.
Boxes.
That's right, call boxes. Know where the exits are. Mm-hmm. Know where the entrance and exits are to your parking lots, your classroom. Just don't be the slowest guy. No, I'm just kidding. not the ship.
But I know. But just take a minute to think about, okay, if things go bad, where would I go? What would I do?
Right. That's it. That's all.
Am I boxed in? Is there a way to,
That's right.
to go?
You go into your classroom, sit down, you look at the exits, you look at the entrances. Are they down at the bottom of the classroom or at the back? And just know, hey, if someone comes in here, I'm going to go that way. If someone comes in there, I'm going to go that way. And it's a 5-10 second thought process, and then you move on and you go about your business. But it's that planting that seed of having that forethought, and because when it happens, that's what you're going to revert to, because you've already thought it out. You don't need to be thinking about those things when it happens. Right. Okay. Because it's too late at that point.
Right. And just like Eric did, I want to give a reminder to everybody who's watching this Solutionaries live chat with Mike Matranga. You can text us your questions, especially your questions for Mike. This can be questions about safety programs, physical security, and other types of measures. Just text the word safety to 866-996-5772. That's 866-996-5772. And we've also had folks leaving questions, not just questions, but also comments on our stories, which you can watch on our Solutionaries YouTube page. And this comment is, again, from the Houston area, and this isn't necessarily in your wheelhouse, but I'm sure reflective on how a lot of parents feel. And this comment is there a way to really ensure your child's safety from school?
From school.
And, homeschool, I mean, because there's some people who'd put homeschool. How do you ensure your child's safety? Homeschool. Well, some parents may not be able to do that. So that's what people are thinking. Do I start homeschooling now because of everything that's going on? Is that another deal? Or do you think that maybe we're not there yet, that's not necessary to definitely ensure your child's safety?
No, I think that you have just as many hazards at home as you do at school in some situations. But I think that, and I could be wrong, but I think the context of the question is, how do you ensure your child's safety, from school? Maybe if you're at home is maybe what I'm reading that. There's a ton of technology out there that parents can monitor. You've got Life 360, and that's not a plug for Life 360, but you keep, the whereabouts of your child. You can monitor them. Mm-hmm. There's Bark, there's Gaggle, there's all different types of technologies that parents can utilize to communicate with their children. One of the things that I'm starting to see a trend of in education is schools going away from, kids having cell phones because they say it's a distraction. And I will tell you, we tried that. We tried that for a year, and it just didn't work. And then as a parent, I looked at that and I examined that myself and said, hey, I want my child to have the ability to communicate with me in the event of a crisis, right? But then that unfolds a whole lot of other issues with communication, with law enforcement, with your cell phone signals jamming up. If you look at historically.
Well, how did you discuss it with your children?
just in general how to
But
communicate.
with the cell phones, like you don't want it to be a distraction in school, you don't want them to get in trouble, you don't want it to get confiscated, but have the ability to communicate with you if there is a crisis.
Right. I told my kids, here's the thing. If there's ever a situation as catastrophic as Santa Fe or Uvalde or any other incident that's happened throughout the United States, find safety first, right? I don't care if that's running out of the building, I don't care if that's hiding in a closet, whatever that is, seek refuge. My kids know the difference between cover and concealment because of my background. Find that first. Then let me know that you're okay, right? And then from there, if you've got to, move to a different position as you're paying attention to maybe gunshots are approaching, I would, encourage no one to leave that leave their safe spot if gunshots are approaching. But I told my kids, same thing, OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act, right? Don't be on your phone as the event is happening, but if you can find that safe space, you've sought that refuge, you've got that safe space, you think you have time to do that, to communicate with us, do it. But that should not be the priority, is communicating with me in the event of a crisis. Their priority should be focused on the event, on the attacker, what's going on, so that they can be consciously aware of what their next decision is going to be. So I would tell parents, listen, I understand as a father, I want to be able to communicate with my kids, but listen, give your kids the ability to seek refuge and get into a safe place before you start demanding or start, calling them or seeking them, or calling them to text you to let you know what's going on. So it's a really tough one, as a parent.
It's a fine line.
It's a very fine line, It's the most important piece is to teach your kids to find a safe place first, whether it's running out of the door or whether it's seeking refuge. Find that first, then communication is secondary.
Okay, one of the things I want to go back to is your years as a Secret Service agent, obviously, making sure that your buildings are secure, your areas are secure, and now that's really your specialty, is you do audits of these school campuses. What are you seeing are kind of common weak spots? Maybe something that parents can possibly address with schools to make sure that it's not happening on their child's campus. What are you seeing are some common weak spots?
Yeah, I think that in the past, some of the decisions that were made regarding safety and security were okay for the past, but we are now living in a different society, right? Where we have to have the right person for the job. And I've been saying this for a while. This is not a business plug, but we have to have the right people making the decisions on how to keep staff and students safe. In the past, what we've seen is educators primarily making those decisions because it was just kind of a secondary thing to them. It was a responsibility that was given to a superintendent or assistant superintendent or a IT director. It was just another one of the 10 hats that they wear every day. And so therefore it didn't get the attention that it needed. And, they were just checking boxes. And I think what we've learned through all of this stuff, especially after Robb Elementary, is they actually passed their audit. But none of that meant anything. So what I would say is, parents, ask your superintendent, ask your school board, who's in charge, what their qualifications are. Ask yourself, why would a lifelong educator be put in charge of securing your schools and keeping your kids safe? Why would that not be an individual like myself or other professionals like myself with the same background and maybe safety, security, emergency management, knows how to coordinate these events and how to plan for these events? Teachers and educators need to teach. Let security experts do their job. And I think that we're going to see a trend here moving in the near future of school districts hiring more individuals like myself. And I've said it time and time again, and maybe it's not a popular thing. We absolutely have to have men and women in uniform to help secure our schools and to keep our kids and our staff safe. But at the end of the day, what we know is that a basic patrolman or someone who has basic patrol skills is not the same as a security professional. we look at things differently. We look at different angles. We look at different means and ways to attack, how you mitigate those things, what technologies that we can use as a force multiplier to amplify or to serve as that manpower enhancement to that security plan, to assist that officer that's in that campus. To be, listen, most campuses, elementary campuses, have one officer, right? Secondaries have at least two, depending on the size.
If that. Yeah.
Some may have none. I just did a district out in West Texas. Our team just did an audit out there. They don't have any law enforcement at all. They have no contracts, law enforcement officers. They have no MOUs. They have no plan. And so I said, listen, at the end of the day, you've got to make some hard decisions here. And so, that's what we do. We come in, we do your audit, we do physical security assessments, we do all of your tactical planning, all your emergency response planning. We merge technology with the plan so that your communication is key. You can get instant communication on multiple different levels: cell phones, your LED screens, your PA systems, your radios, your desktops. All of that stuff has to be integrated together. And so, nothing against law enforcement, but your average law enforcement officer doesn't have the experience in that space like we do as a security professional.
Well, and we keeping with that was technology. I want to remind everybody that some of our colleagues in Florida and Michigan did look at how school security can be improved with simple changes to doors, windows, other features like that. In fact, in Detroit, our partners at WDIV interviewed the makers of Nightlock. Now, this is a door security device that essentially reinforces the doors to prevent anyone from getting in. Same company also has a cover that goes over windows. And in Jacksonville, our partners at WJXT flew to New York State, where they took a look at bullet-resistant film to go on glass windows. So when you talk about that, like you had talked about, and I asked that a little bit, when you're seeing physical security, maybe where some of the weak spots are in physical security there, most schools, especially older schools, they were not designed to be fortresses. So what do parents need to, when they look at a school or they try and talk to their administrators about what's being done to possibly make this campus more secure, especially an older building that was not designed to be a fortress? What should they look for? What can be done to try and shore up some of those soft spots?
There's a ton of that. Again, it goes back to hiring the right individual. Listen, there's some very talented individuals in our law enforcement space, right? But I assure you that I think I look at things a little bit different than those guys. Our methods can be taught, not a problem. But you look at some of the new architecture that's being brought into school districts. I was in a school district last month that's built a $160 million high school. There are classrooms that have glass from the ceiling to the floor. The standard response protocol says locks, lights, out of sight, go to your hard corner. Where are those kids going to go? And so what I would say is...
How do you fix that? I mean, if you're a parent who is concerned about that, how do you address that?
There are things that you can do, right? But it also costs additional money. It goes back to creating a standard throughout the state. And so one of the things that I talked about in my multiple testimonies before the Senate and even with the governor's office is that the state of Texas is like the Wild West. Each district has the ability to do their own thing, right? If they want to put ballistic walls in, if they want to put glass walls, they can do that. And so what I'm saying is that as a parent, going back and retrofitting old schools is rough, right? It's going to cost more money. But what my argument is that when school districts, and we just did this in 2 districts in the state of Texas, they brought us in to build their bond from nuts to bolts, everything, to include the mental health resources, social emotional learning programs, emotional intelligence programs, and the infrastructure, hardening of the infrastructure with the technological piece from beginning to end. And this is what they're pushing to their community in November.
Well, so maybe that's something on discussions if a district is talking about bonds coming up, because that's frequent now. Maybe be a little more vocal about, hey, are you making sure that there's money built in for these additional items?
So So just like having a security professional look at your existing schools, you need to have a security professional looking at and working with your architect firm and identifying these vulnerabilities in these architectural drawings and plans, and then putting things in place to address those. One of the things that we did at our district, and this is really not, I mean, I can't share the method, but what we did is my team and I had a very very robust team of professionals, 2 former Army guys and a former Air Force veteran that worked with me at Texas City. And what we did is, when we built our 4 brand new schools, we took and we broke down those campuses and identified all the vulnerabilities with our architect, and we built those schools to what I think is the standard through the state. And the state has to get on board with talking to these architect firms and saying, hey, no more glass walls. Right? Our kids can't seek refuge. Yeah, it may look pretty, it's inviting, I understand the educational concept, but at the end of the day, it doesn't stop bullets. Kids have no place to hide. And so what we did at our district with those 4 new schools is, like I said, is we identified those vulnerable areas where there could be access to a public access area where someone could get into a hallway, and every single classroom now has a level 8 ballistic panel that we use the specs from the company in which we contracted the product from. And then we also did our own independent testing, which stopped an AK-47 round, a 5.56, which is an AR-15 commonly used round, and then every handgun. And people might say, well, that's too costly. Well, I will beg to differ. The average cost of the elementary campuses that we built was $30 million. We we built those new schools with that ballistic material in those walls for about, on average, $375,000. Most districts, big districts, spend that much money on paper a year. So what's it worth to you? And so what I would say is, parents, get involved in that bond process. Ask them what security features they're building into those schools. What I would also tell you is, contact your politicians. Make them create a building standard throughout the state of Texas. We have a building standard in regards to fire alarms and fire suppression systems, been in existence since the 1950s. When's the last time we've had a school burned to the ground? Probably the 1950s, which generated that law being passed. The same should be had with building standards and security throughout the state. And I'll tell you why. In Uvalde, one of the things that was discovered is that the handles on each classroom door did not have the ability to lock, right? From the inside, okay? Every campus that I've been on since Uvalde has had the same handles. The teachers cannot lock the doors from the inside, right? So then they, contract out, or they purchase devices like Night Lock or Teacher Lock and whatnot to utilize that as a reinforcement. My argument is that the state needs to build that standard approach that when, because we see law enforcement responding from all over the place in these events, that when you go from one district to the next district, the same handles should be in place. Not exactly the same, but let's give some type of standardization, right? Let's give 4 or 5 different types of handles. Let's give 4 or 5 different types of glass, or intrusion film on the glass, so that when law enforcement's responding, they're not having to figure out, how are we going to breach this door? We've never seen this product before.
Waiting on keys.
Waiting on keys. One of the things that we did and that we do, and we pushed out to a local district here in Houston, and I will tell you, if this district's bond passes, and I'll let them do the marketing piece, but if this district's bond passes, that district will far exceed anything that I did at Texas City ISD, and I'm willing to state that if they take our advice and our plan from ground up and implement those changes, they will be the safest school in the state of Texas. Same thing with the district we just finished in El Paso. And so not only did we provide that holistic plan from infrastructure to technology to mental health to law enforcement response and planning, we provided that under their budget as well, which is important. And so, people get locked up, and when I start talking about some of these ballistic walls that we created in these brand new schools in our district in Texas City, the first thing is, oh God, that had to cost a lot of money. And listen, $375,000, $400,000 is a lot of money, but in the grand scheme of things, when you're spending $30 million on a campus, that's nothing to protect our children. We've got a lieutenant governor right now talking about spending $50 million on ballistic shields, and he's arguing that that's going to expedite response to an active shooter. It would have done nothing. It did nothing. There were shields on Uvalde's campus within 3 minutes. It made no difference. So I would ask that we talk to our elected officials as parents. I'm a parent, and say, listen, let's have some real conversations. Let's not make this political. Let's get out there, let's make some serious changes, and let's have Texas be the standard throughout the nation by creating that first standard in schools and how we build these schools and how we protect our staff and our students.
All right. We got another question that was just texted in, and this is coming from Lisa from Texas City ISD.
Oh.
Yes, texted us a question. She asked, should a student be responsible for making sure others are safe first before making sure they are safe?
No.
Okay.
You're responsible for you. Yeah. No, I do not think so. That makes no sense. Why would you make sure that, as a student, make sure that someone else is safe before you're safe? You can't help them if you can't protect and defend yourself. Self-preservation in that situation is always precedent. You preserve yourself, and then you assist others. That's one of the things that I want to talk about, actually, is we talk about law enforcement coming in, saving the day. Let me ask you a question. In Santa Fe, in Uvalde, in Sutherland Springs, in Parkland, did law enforcement stop any killing, really? Did they save anybody?
Well, the argument, you can make the argument, I'm not going to say that, but in Santa Fe, that when they did get in, they at least pinned him down and kept him from going to different areas. And I think that's I get that question because I've heard it before, and it's a hard one to say because they do go in and they at least something stops.
They isolate, right? But once they got there, he was already isolated, whether it be him or whether it be Rob, right? Rob Elementary. My point is this: we have to get better at training ourselves, right? And we have to get better at training our staff, right? The question of should you assist someone else before you provide assistance to yourself? No, absolutely not. Like I said, if you cannot preserve your own life, you can't preserve anybody else's. And so that's what I'm getting at, is self-sustainability. Law enforcement is going to do their job. They're going to come in, they're going to isolate. Whether they save someone's life or not, it's going to be contingent upon the situation.
You're not saying it's every man for themselves, so to speak, are you?
No, of course not.
Right. Okay.
But you have to put yourself first, or you can't save another man, right? That's just basic common sense. I cannot help someone else if I myself am compromised or injured, right? So what I'm getting at is, we talk about self-sustainability. We've got to get better at teaching staff and even some students on how to self-treat, whether it be medically or self-evacuate.
And there is some that do that. Cristobal ISD, which is in Tom Green County, very rural county, but I remember every staff had to go through basic first aid training. They put little medical kits in every classroom that you could do a tournament. You could, open up somebody's airways if they had an occlusion. So I see what you're saying, and some districts have gone that route.
Yeah, we did that. Texas City did that. We issued 1,400 tourniquets to our entire staff, and we trained our entire staff in stop the bleed and for basic first aid CPR. Because here's the thing, like I said, no offense to our brothers and sisters in blue, but their job is to come in and stop the killing, isolate that shooter, so that there is no further death, right, or injuries. The person who's likely to save you, whether it be in a school or whether it be in an office building or whether it be in a mall, is either yourself or the person standing next to you right then. It could be the person in the office next to you. It could be the person in the classroom next to you. And so we saw that in Santa Fe with Scott Rice, or with Flo Rice, who was the substitute teacher that was shot 5 times in Santa Fe. Officer after officer came in, no one provided medical aid to her. She called her husband, and he came from home, went in the school, got his wife, put her in his car, and drove her to the hospital himself. Right. And so
But that's part of the training, but they're saying until the active shooter threat's been stopped, they're trained not to stop.
Correct.
And render aid, right?
And I am not saying that they're wrong.
Right.
I'm just telling you that seconds matter in those instances. And what we've seen historically is that it takes some time for law enforcement to actually say, hey, we believe that we have this individual contained. It may take 10 minutes, it may take 30 minutes, it may take 77 minutes.
And to somebody bleeding to death, that's an ocean of time.
That is an ocean of time. And so if you can apply the tourniquet yourself, or you can apply the tourniquet to someone else, that is the key. That's where we're really going to preserve life. So I am a big fan of, let's teach everybody how to do that. One of the things that we're missing is, we're talking about tourniquets. Mm-hmm. We have to also talk about chest seals. Second leading cause of death in an active shooter event is not a bleed. That's the third leading cause of death. The second leading cause of death is a torso wound. So we have to teach these individuals how to apply a chest seal.
Just so something like that. Now, I want to go back to something that you had touched on a moment ago, because we just got another question in from a parent in Sugar Land. And Adrian asks, how will schools pay for services like yours?
It's a good question. I will tell you that, the majority of the projects that we do are under the district's individual purchase or single purchase amount. Mm-hmm. Most districts, TASA, TASB, because I'm a school board, I know what the new regulation is, or what the new recommendation is that most districts can spend up to $100,000 without board approval. I can tell you that there's not a job that we've done yet that exceeds $65,000, and that was for a district that had 17 campuses. And I
all
think
things for parents to ask school boards when they go to school board meetings, things of that nature.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, we do things a little different. We do way more than just the standard, Texas School Safety Center audit. We go in, we provide a physical security assessment, we identify all the vulnerabilities. The audit itself is a start. I have somewhat been critical of the audit.
You're talking about the school safety center.
The Texas School Safety Center audit. Listen, they're great people. Dr. Prather does a good job. Selena Bly there does a good job. The alert is housed there. They do a fantastic job. The problem I have with the way that the mandate is written is that there is no teeth. The legislature gave them the responsibility of enforcing or pushing these mandates out to school districts, but gave them no authority to really impose any type of punitive measures. It's got to come from TEA. Well, out of the 1,022, you only had 67 that were compliant. Only one district had any type of punitive measures last year. Those are the questions that parents need to be asking, right? And so getting back to my point with her, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, please go ahead and finish what you're saying.
Yeah, so we're getting back to how do districts afford guys like me. I can tell you that we're doing an assessment for a very popular private school here in Houston for $7,500. But that's an assessment, that's us teaching an active shooter course and a Stop the Bleed course to their safety and security team. So, we're never going to let pricing get in the way of us providing a service to.
So you'll work with districts?
I will absolutely work with districts. We have a team of 18 contractors. Some of these you go to my website, you don't see who we have because I like it that way. I will tell you that there are at least 5 other individuals with the same credentials that I have on our team, and then some. We don't need to brag about who we have on our team. You'll find out if you hire us, but we're not going to let money get in the way of us preserving kids' lives and changing the mindset in school security, not only in the state of Texas, but throughout the nation. Okay. We'll absolutely work with districts.
Before I go to my next point, I do want to remind everybody, again, we've been getting these really great questions, and so if you do have a question about school safety and security, just text the word safety to 866-996-5772. That's 866-996-5772. Now, before we move on to one other point, I wanted to go back to something that you had said about, especially with Senate Bill 11. This is something that we've explored and that we're continuing to explore. One of the things is that behavioral threat assessment that Senate Bill 11 now requires districts to do. Well, one of the things that, and this was it was amazing, but right before Uvalde happened, I did an interview with the director of training for the School Safety Center, and what he said was one of the problems with that is school districts are putting these teams in place, but they don't really know how to operationalize it. They don't know how to do it. And so when you start thinking about it from a common sense standpoint, these are educators and administrators. How do you necessarily know what is pre-attack behavior versus what is just kind of weird teenage behavior?
Yeah, you know, listen, again, addressing parents. Parents have got to get engaged. Parents know when their kids have issues. You know, I know when something's wrong with my children. Parents know these things, right? But even beyond parents, community knows. It's been proven after every single mass shooting event. You know, what is the first thing that we hear from the first person that they interview who's maybe a family member or a friend is, yes, this individual had these particular types of behaviors which we all thought were unusual or uncommon. We just didn't know what to do or where to go because we didn't have the resources, or we just thought maybe it was something they were working through. You know, listen, if your child is exhibiting violent behavior in a way in which you think is unusual, if your child is withdrawn and they've stopped associating with their friends, they've you know, they're in their room, which a lot of kids are in their room these days on their phones. I know mine are too. But you know when it's different,
there's a difference,
right? You know when it's different. If your child is abusing animals, if your child is talking about violent behavior, or exhibiting violent behavior, or talking about violent acts, or has become very engrossed with violent movies or video games or rhetoric, if your child has exhibited signs or symptoms of suicide, those are things that you just should not overlook. There are resources out there. Unfortunately, we, over the last couple decades in the state, in the state of Texas, but in this nation, we have shut down, you know, state-run institutions. And I think that has had a tremendous impact on what we're seeing.
No, I mean, definitely a lack of inpatient care. We have a lot of emergency to where if somebody goes into an acute crisis state, we can get the individual stabilized, you know, but then after that, the long-term care, the inpatient care, the follow-up care, it's not there.
Those things have to change. And, you know, we talk about programs within our school. You know, one of the things that I begged the Senate in 2018 to do was change the title of our counselors on our campuses to academic advisors, because primarily that's what they are. They're academic advisors. A lot of the counselors on these high school and grade school campuses are not qualified to handle mental health or you know, self-harm behaviors. And so what I said is, let's make academic counselors or let's make the counselors that currently we have academic counselors, and then let's hire actual counselors that deal with these problems on our campuses. And then beyond that, it even goes deeper than that. Let's stop trying to just address and fix the child. Let's go to the source, to the household. Maybe that's where it's coming from. There's always an external source. It's not enough just to treat the symptom. We have to treat the cause. And so, you know, I'm a big fan. I will publicly state it. I am a fan, as a Republican, I am a fan of social emotional learning and emotional intelligence programs in schools. They have to be the right ones. They have to be vetted, obviously, with no political intent. But those programs must be in schools. We live in a very different society. We're not in the 80s anymore. We're not in the 90s. Even the early 2000s, the rhetoric has changed. The goalposts have changed. The expectations of our kids and society has changed. We have become a more violent society. We need to have emotional intelligence programs in our schools that are teaching our kids the triggers within themselves that make them want to hurt themselves or someone else, and how to deal with them and then pull themselves away from that. That is key, is self-awareness. And then teaching the parent also, hey, listen, this doesn't just apply to kids. This applies to parents as well, right? Everyone needs to know what these coping mechanisms are. But I don't care if it's the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, whoever's spouting this narrative that these programs are terrible in our campuses and throughout our schools, they're doing more harm than good, and they need to stop with this political rhetoric.
Well, and that gets off into the political
points.
Debate too.
And I'm not going to. I don't want to get into a political debate.
Right. But the one thing, because this is important, because we had talked about this. You had said that it's everybody's responsibility to be alert. So in fact, that's something our partners at WSLS in Virginia covered. See something, say something. So let's go into what you were saying about those triggers and everything. What are specific things that parents or maybe just friends, other students, are signs that they need to look for that may be problematic? Again, how do you differentiate? What specifically can you look for that will help you differentiate between somebody who is potentially heading down a violent path versus somebody who may be just having a rough time in life?
Correct. Yeah, I think that, signs and symptoms can be different than in anyone. The things that I would consider, and I think that the National Threat Assessment Center has said since 1999, after Columbine, people that want to hurt themselves or others usually become withdrawn, right? They usually have a sense of hopelessness. They possibly, and in some cases, participate in self-mutilation, whether it be through cutting. They are fixated on certain things, usually in more of the adults rather than children, but political issues and the political climate, changing their personality, having conflicts with their neighbors, with their family members, abusing animals, all of the things that we've known for decades, that after every single shooting, I'm asked, and other subject matter experts are asked by our politicians, how do we stop these things? What are the signs and symptoms? They've always been there. You know what they are. These are the things, all of them are always there. Look at Ramos, for example. Kids walking around with a bag full of dead cats. There's something wrong with that. Mm-hmm. Why did we not do something? I always refer to the 2008 National Threat Assessment Center report called the Bystander report. Oh, yeah. And it talks about how in over 88%, almost 90% of the cases up to 2008, the tragedy could have been averted if someone had just said something, if a bystander.
But there's a lot of assumption. It's that bystander effect where somebody assumes somebody else has already said something, so they don't necessarily do it.
But here's the thing, we've got to get away from that ideology, right? Because we can no longer depend upon or think that it's someone else's responsibility. I would ask anybody who's in that situation that may say, well, maybe someone else has reported it. Well, what if they didn't? What are the consequences if they did not?
Okay.
And you didn't do what you should have done and report that behavior, and then they go and they kill 19 kids and 2 teachers. Do you want that on your conscience? Can you?
Well, no, and I don't think anybody would, but I get what you're saying. Assumption is no longer acceptable.
Absolutely not.
Okay.
Yeah.
And let me ask you this, because we did, and this is actually a great question. I've heard this before. This is a question from Michelle, who lives in Centerville, and she asked, do you think talking about it too much with your kids is actually encouraging them to do what you're describing? I guess that whole, standing on the precipice and contemplating a plunge.
Yes, I agree. Yeah. Yes, Michelle. I do think that there is a very fine line where you can talk about it too much. And that's why I always say that it needs to be an age-appropriate conversation. And it doesn't always have to be about active shootings. It's just awareness in general to societal changes, which have become norm so yes, I do think that there is a point where we can plant that seed in someone's head because we're focusing on it too much.
Okay. We've also
Fair
got some
question.
Okay, I agree. And there's similar questions. We have Bianca in San Antonio wants to know about security measures and vulnerabilities on school buses.
That's a tough one. Bianca, you've done some research. I will tell you that school buses are my worst fear. They're almost impossible to defend. So there are some measures that can be put in place, but yes, they are my worst fear. That's all I can say about that. I really don't want to
Without going into great detail, what are a couple of them? I mean, what are a couple of the measures that can be done?
You need to make sure that, again, your bus driver is situationally aware. If they're pulling up to a bus stop and there's an unusual person there, make sure that you're creating enough distance between yourself, those children, and that person. Checking for hands, checking for vehicles that may be parked nearby. Just having effective communication. Those buses, I would recommend that those buses have communication devices that allow them to communicate directly with law enforcement, because what we see as a common trend is that in school districts, there's always a centralized dispatch, but that dispatch goes back to another employee back at the maintenance barn or whatnot. There are communications that we deployed that allow school bus drivers to talk directly to law enforcement. And it also tracks their movements, what we call is like a crumble, like a cookie crumble.
Right, of course, right. So you can see where the bus, and I think some have rolled out apps this year. Some districts have rolled out apps where parents can actually track the bus.
Yeah, but I mean, it's great. It's good situational awareness and peace of mind for the parent, but knowing that your kid got on the bus and off the bus is great. But in the event of a crisis, if someone were to take that bus hostage, it doesn't really do you a whole lot, know. So I will tell you, there is a program that the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Transportation has that we utilize, where they come out and they will assess your buses and your transportation. It's a very nice program, and it's free. It's free to all public education.
Oh, really?
It's free, yes. And
okay,
it is
I didn't know
beautiful.
That. What's the program called?
Oh, God, I can't remember the name of the program, but I will get it to you.
Okay.
We had Department of Homeland Security and DOT come out, and they conducted a complete assessment.
Department of Transportation. Yeah. Okay.
And
all right.
It's very nice.
Okay, but I will get that, and we will pass that program on. I didn't realize it was a free program that would come out and do that. So in keeping with that, somewhat of these kind of softer targets even beyond the school campus, we have another question, and please forgive me if I mispronounce this, but Swetha in Spring asks about safety in school districts where you have classes in portable buildings. And I know I've heard this for years, that's kind of a nightmare for security professionals.
It is. It is a very good question. It is a nightmare for portables and for security professionals. Portables have to be fenced. They absolutely have to be fenced. You've got kids walking to and from campuses unsecured. They have to be fenced. They just don't provide any ballistic material for the students. And so one of the things that we did at Texas City, and that is kind of standard for us in every district we go to, is access control on every classroom door. We talk about using emerging technology to our favor. And being able to integrate multiple pieces of that technology. One of the things that I would recommend for portables is that you have electronic locks on every classroom door so that they can close and shut and lock automatically, that's connected with the other access control module or panels inside of the actual primary school, and then having a reinforced lock on that door. Now, I don't want to get hung up too much on locks on doors, because it's, until now, no one's breached a classroom. But listen, I would rather districts spend a little extra money to provide peace of mind to those students and staff members inside the classrooms, knowing that that door is secured with an additional reinforced lock, than not do it at all.
Again, all things that parents can address with school boards.
Correct.
Go to school board meetings, ask, at least raise the question.
Yes.
Right. Now we're going to go, Michelle from Detroit, Michigan has also texted us a question. Yes, she wants to know about creating safety protocols for students with disabilities, like physical or intellectual disabilities. That's actually, that's very important. Yeah.
That is very important, very, very important, and it is very frequently and often overlooked. People don't usually take into consideration students that may be immobile or that have some type of medical condition where they have to use the restroom or whatnot, within a certain period of time.
Right. Possibly, typically, or possibly not neurotypical is.
Yes.
Right.
What we would say is that most of those districts, that is going to fall under their special education department. Okay. We would work with that special education department to make sure that all of those individual students' needs were met in the event of a crisis, whether they needed additional food, resources, and that those things were available and on standby. Now, in regards
so that's something parents need to check and make sure
absolutely,
that's already in place.
Yes,
Yeah.
if your child is a student that requires, additional care, absolutely, you have to ask those questions. And I think most people will find that their districts are not prepared. I'm not trying to raise, the alarm, but I will tell you that the majority of districts that we go into and we do these audits and these assessments on, the districts are not as prepared as they need to be. The biggest fear for me is an immobile child having to evacuate. There has to be a written plan. Everybody has to understand who's responsible for those children, right? So, parents with children with disabilities like that, hold the feet to the fire, ask the schools, make sure that they have a plan, ask to see it for your child if your child is in that situation.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's great. And again, you've been hearing, we've been getting these questions from around the country. So if you do have a question about school safety and security, just text the word safety to 866-996-5772. That's 866-996-5772. And like with most mass shootings, politics on gun control inevitably creep in. And so this comment comes from Jacksonville, Florida, and it relates to the national question on gun control. This person asks, how about we do something about the ability for an 18-year-old to go out, buy a weapon of war, and then proceed to massacre so many children? Unfortunately, that question, and I know it's been asked a lot, that comes with so many different levels to it, and I think that's why you see such a political divide on the issue. How do you address that without being political? I think it's impossible.
I'll tell you this, most politicians will skirt this question all day long. I'm not going to do that. I'm a Republican. I'm our district chair. I do not think that 18-year-olds need to be able to purchase an AR-15. I am a firm believer in the Second Amendment. I own multiple weapons. I'm an avid hunter. I'm an avid sports shooter. I, carried an AR-15 for a living for a long period of time. And I will tell you that I do not think that 18-year-olds should be able to purchase an AR-15. There is no justifiable reason for it. When a 18-year-old kid can't walk into a convenience store and purchase a beer because his or her judgment may be skewed, and then they can't walk out of that convenience store, walk to a gun store and ask to purchase a Glock 19 because they're not of age or they're not 21, but in the same cabinet and in the same breath can say, let me purchase an AR-15 with 1,000 rounds of ammunition with high capacity magazines, and they can do that. I don't understand the justification for that. And so we've got to get real. We've got to stop politicizing everything. We've got to stop pandering to votes based upon our rhetoric, and we've got to be realistic. Our kids are dying because of of politics.
One of the other things that has come up in terms of laws, and we got another question from the Jacksonville area that I want to get to, but I want to ask this quickly because this has also come out. Not every school shooter actually went out and purchased the gun legally.
Correct.
Some, in Santa Fe's case, got them from the house. So what about the laws regarding allowing a minor access to fire, or allowing a child access to firearms that then is used in an act like a school shooting?
I'll happily answer this one as well. Again, avid hunter, big Second Amendment guy. I'm responsible for my weapons. As a hunter, as a gun owner, I'm responsible for them. If they get in the hands of someone that they should not get in the hands of because of my carelessness, I'm responsible. And I believe that if I make a weapon accessible to a person who carries out a mass attack or injures themselves or someone else, I should be held responsible, not at a misdemeanor level. A misdemeanor is a slap on the wrist. There's no motivation for people to do what's right, and that's secure their weapons if they know that there's really not a whole lot of consequences. I believe that this should be a felony.
Okay.
It's a dangerous weapon. It's just like carrying, or driving drunk. Hey, listen, you drive drunk and you kill somebody, you're charged with manslaughter.
Or you can go murder. I mean, they can charge people with murder.
Why is it different for a weapon?
We're getting close to the end of our time, so we have a couple more questions that we came in. Like I had said, I want to get to Pete from Jacksonville, Florida. Sent us a message about standardized directional signage at schools. Would this help in a more timely response from law enforcement? Kind of explain that to me, because I'm not really well versed in that.
I think I know what Pete's talking about. I don't think that the signage is going to matter much. What I think will matter more than even signage is that people putting aside their feelings, understanding their role and their position in these situations, training on the event, training to the plan, not just seeing it one time, seeing it multiple times. If we're going to require that school districts do active shooter drills, lockdown, lockout, shelter in place, hold, evacuate, once a month, then we should require at least twice a year that all of the stakeholders that are going to be responding.
So potentially everybody who could respond
to
that, right?
The first time those agencies are responding to that campus shouldn't be the first time they see that campus.
And I think that did come out of Uvalde. I mean, we had more than 300 officers from 23 different agencies all converging on Robb Elementary, and none of them had cross-trained with each other. Now, individually, they had all had active shooter training, but they had not cross-trained that what happens if Border Patrol shows up with City of Uvalde along with ISD Uvalde, and then you have then you have all these other agencies. You had game wardens show up. Yeah.
But I think it goes back to what I initially said, is that there has to be hard conversations with these individuals, and people have to put their feelings aside, and the assessment of their capabilities and response times has to be practical. The first thing that I did when I got to our district is I brought all of our stakeholders, our law enforcement stakeholders, in a room, and I asked them, who can respond to every campus and every building within our district within 5 minutes? Raise your hand. Technically four agencies raised their hand out of a dozen. I said, congratulations, you're now our new primary responders. You are the only individuals that are allowed to enter our campus so that we don't create a condition of chaos by having other agencies coming in. Now, the other additional, 8 started, we were taken aback and said, well, wait a minute, we've got a SWAT team, we've got this resource, we've got that resource. My follow-up question was, how far out is your SWAT team from responding? Is it a full-time SWAT team? Can they get there within 5 minutes? No, it takes 45 minutes for them to deploy. Well, then they're a secondary responder. Your agency is a secondary responder. We appreciate you. We appreciate your willingness to help us. We shake your hand, whatever. But at the end of the day, we want you to go to the designated staging area wherever we've designated that to be in this process of us planning. We want you to stay there so that we don't have 376 officers descending upon one facility and then clogging and just completely creating that atmosphere of chaos. There's no situation in a campus that I can think of that I don't think that 12 officers or 15 officers couldn't handle. So the others need to understand, everybody wants to be a hero in those situations, and I get it. That's what everybody signed up to do. They want to do that, right? Everybody wants to be, the SEAL who shot Osama bin Laden, but you can't be. Sometimes your most important place and role is that secondary responder. of showing up and realizing that your buddies have that situation under control, I need to start assessing and applying bandages or tourniquets or chest seals or moving individuals.
Or helping the children who have been evacuated go somewhere.
Right. And so those are the conversations that they have to have, right? It is imperative. And if people are not having those conversations and they're not designating who those primary and secondary responders are, if an event happens on their campus, they will have another Uvalde, they will have another Santa Fe, where people are confused of who's in charge.
Okay. And I want to go to another comment, and it touches on what we talked about reserve officers before, but we have another comment from a viewer. Veterans are in need of employment and they are highly trained. Are there programs to hire veterans to protect schools?
None that I'm aware of, but like I said earlier, that I do believe that there is some legislation being considered right now with Senator Campbell. In Texas, I would recommend that if you are in Texas, contact her or her staff and ask them.
Who's that again? Say that again.
Senator Campbell.
Okay, and she's working on legislation that would create programs such
Program
as
for
this.
veterans and retired law enforcement or even reserve law enforcement.
Yeah, because I know a lot of officers who've retired but still keep their certification because they go into reserve.
Yeah. Listen. Now, there are some individuals.
I said certification, I meant commission.
Listen,
they carry their commission.
It's got to be a vetting process, you know, because it goes back to the conversation. We have to have the right person. There are some individuals that I worked with that I wouldn't want working in our schools because they're just too hard. They have to have the right mindset. They have to have the right mindset. They have to have the right skill set, and so there has to be a proper vetting process for that. You know, we just can't, carte blanche say, okay, you're a veteran, you're a former law enforcement officer, boom, you're now blessed off.
But that's interesting to know that somebody's at least working on that.
Absolutely, I'm very happy to hear that she and her staff are working on that. Okay. And like I said, I missed the meeting on the 9th because I had an engagement, but I would love to get back engaged in that conversation.
Great. All right. Well, I want to thank you very much. That's going to be all we have for tonight. I really want to thank Mike and everybody else for sharing their time and knowledge. And I would like to thank all of you for joining this live stream chat. Remember, if you do have more questions, please drop them in the comment section of our Solutionaries YouTube page. We're going to do our best to respond, and hopefully we'll have Mike back to answer even more questions. So just scan this QR code and you can watch more of our solution stories and send us ideas of issues that you would like to know more about potential solutions being implemented. Really, thank you for everybody joining us. Mike, thank you for joining us. I hope everyone has a wonderful night.